For this episode of Humans of Whiskey, we find ourselves all the way in Brooklyn, New York City, hanging at Fort Hamilton Distillery with their founder and visionary, Alex Clark.
Dan was a clever guy. So he sold that company to a defense company and then had this building in Red Hook and said, I don't know what to do with it. I've got a 5-year non-compete. I want to build a distillery. Can you help me? And I was like, sure, I can help you with that. Once we started buying whiskey, aged already, and slapped the Widow Jane label on it, it was like, oh, this is gold. So I started selling it out the back of a Honda. First batch was 5-year-old Sazerac whiskey that we got a 270-gallon tote of. So the first ever bottle of Widow Jane was, it was like a 1,400 bottle run. It was in a tall, slender bottle, the Ariane bottle. So if you ever see the 5-year-old Widow Jane, there were only 1,400 bottles of that ever. And it was delicious. There's a picture of me somewhere with a tote, opening it up with a straw to get the first siphon going. And I literally, it's a picture of me with a straw into the tote like that. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We were kind of like, well, Widow Jane is clearly working. What can we do? So we flew down to Kentucky and Indiana with Dave Pickerell, who was helping us out with the brand at the time. And we ended up stumbling around with Dave, sitting in the boardroom with Jim Beam, Buffalo Trace, MGP, and at Willett, where Dave had just put in Drew's still, which he had just started producing. Drew knew that Dave was a rye fan, and I also was a rye fan because I had been making cocktails in East Side for a few years, as well as then moving to Balthazar, a famous restaurant on Spring Street, before helping Dan get Widow Jane up and running. And I've fallen in love with classic American cocktails. My journey with the Milk and Honey guys, and Sasha Petravsky, who taught me how to make a good Manhattan, how to make a good old fashioned. And the base of all these great drinks was rye whiskey. And yet you couldn't really buy rye whiskey in America. It was very difficult to find in the early 2000s. And it was like, what the hell has happened here? Dave Pickerell felt the same about it. He loved rye and wanted to help reignite it. But when we were down with Drew at Willett, Drew pulled out a bottle of 100-year-old rye whiskey, a Monongahela style rye. Famously, these were like the biggest, most beefy, delicious whiskeys that were ever produced in America. And they were made with just rye grain and malted barley, no corn. Monongahela rye is famously somewhere between like 90-10 and 80-20 in the mash. And classically, that's how all the original whiskey mashes were, somewhere in that region. He pulls his bottle out and we taste it and it blows me away. And I'm like, wow, why aren't we making whiskey like this anymore? So that combined with my love of cocktails kind of set me off on a mission to try and recreate that original whiskey style of America, which is what led to the formation of Fort Hamilton. Let's go inside and we'll talk more about the process, as it were. They had planted very heavily all through these fields, all through Long Island, rye grain, because it was pest resistant, resilient to bad weather and wintertime snow, sleet, hail. If you plant it and let it grow during the winter, which it will grow in completely frozen soil, so it's a very useful crop. And so they planted it heavily. So when they needed a new source of raw material for their alcohol, instinctively they reached for rye. Consequently, rye whiskey was the first whiskey ever distilled in America. And it was being distilled right here in Brooklyn in the 1700s. So long before bourbon was a twinkle in a Kentucky distiller's eye, New York was making rye, sorry. So yeah, we kind of wanted to celebrate that. Celebrate the original whiskey style of America. Celebrate it with a historic name, which had some gravity in Fort Hamilton. We live on Fort Hamilton Parkway in Brooklyn. It came to us And we decided to run with it because it celebrates the history of America, the history of that whiskey in America, and that was the whiskey style that we wanted to go after so that we could recreate these classic cocktails as authentically as possible, using an ingredient made in exactly the way it would have been made 200 years ago, you know?
We had an absolutely phenomenal time chopping it up with Alex. We could talk with him all day long. But now, our buddy Dave had a single barrel selection that he had to get to bottling, so it was time for us to roll our sleeves up and get started.
So this is a vacuum pump. It sucks negative pressure through this hose into this overflow chamber, which has this ball on it. So when this overflow chamber fills up, breaks the vacuum, and it can't spill liquid into the vacuum pump and destroy your beautiful machine.
Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, that's it. Somebody gave it to me. Oh, Seth bought it, right? It was like, I don't know.